All right, so the first century, that's AD 1 to 100, kicks off the Common Era right after the BC year's end. Think of it as the opening act for the last 2,000 years. At this point, three big powers dominate: the Roman Empire, Han China, and Parthian Persia. Rome's having a pretty solid run under the Pax Romana, a long stretch of relative peace despite a financial crash in 33, and a messy civil war in 69. They're expanding into Britain, tangling with tribes in Germania, and even pushing into Dacia. Over in North Africa, a Berber leader named Tacfarinas causes headaches for a while before being crushed. In the Middle East, Rome fights an inconclusive war with Parthia and puts down a major Jewish revolt in 66 to 73, which ends with Jerusalem's second temple destroyed in 70, a huge moment in Jewish history. Meanwhile, over in China, the Han dynasty gets interrupted by a short-lived Xin dynasty, which collapses after big rebellions. The Eastern Han returns in 25, bringing a golden age under emperors Ming and Zhang. They even managed to take down their northern enemy, the Xiongnu, by 91. Religiously, Christianity is born. Jesus is crucified in the 30s under the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, sparking a movement that spreads far beyond Palestine. At first, Christians face persecution, especially after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 when they're blamed for it. And nature's not sitting still either. An earthquake in 17 wipes out a dozen cities in Asia Minor. Famine hits Judea mid-century, and then there's the big one, Mount Vesuvius in 79. Pompeii and Herculaneum get buried under ash and pumice, freezing an entire Roman moment in time. As the first century closed, the world's empires were standing strong, but under the surface, cracks were forming. The second century would bring both new heights of power and the first real signs that nothing lasts forever. The second century, AD 101 to 200, is when the Roman Empire hits its absolute peak under Emperor Trajan. At this point, Rome stretches further than it ever will again. But after Trajan dies, the empire shifts gears. No more aggressive expansion, just holding on to what they've got. This is the golden age of the five good emperors, a rare run of rulers who were both competent and well-liked. The economy's strong, culture's thriving, and life for most Roman citizens is relatively stable. But not everything is perfect. In Judea, Emperor Hadrian brutally crushes the Bar Kokhba revolt, driving the Jewish population out of Jerusalem entirely. The good times start to fade in the late hundreds. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher, emperor, and last of the five good emperors, dies in 180, and his son Commodus takes over. Commodus turns out to be, well, not so good. When he's assassinated in 192, Rome is thrown into chaos, the year of the five emperors. After a brutal game of musical thrones, Septimius Severus emerges on top, founding the Severan dynasty after defeating his rivals in two major battles. Meanwhile, over in China, the Han dynasty spends the first half of the century riding high, even extending deep into Central Asia. But the second half is a slow-motion collapse. Corruption spreads, rebellions break out, and in 189, warlord Dong Zhuo seizes control of the capital after the emperor's regent is killed. This sparks years of infighting between rival warlords. By the year 200, Cao Cao, one of the sharpest political operators in Chinese history, has the emperor under his protection and cements his power by defeating his main rival at the Battle of Guandu. The second century leaves us with two empires still standing, but both showing serious cracks. The third century? That's when the cracks start turning into full-on earthquakes. The third century, AD 201 to 300, is when the Roman Empire hits one of its roughest patches ever. It starts strong enough under the Severan dynasty, but in 235, Emperor Severus Alexander is assassinated. That kicks off what historians call the crisis of the third century, 50 years of absolute chaos. We're talking constant civil wars, barbarian invasions, economic collapse, and the empire literally breaking into pieces. At one point, you've got the Gallic Empire running things in the west, the Palmyrene Empire in the east, and Rome stuck in the middle trying not to fall apart completely. Somehow, Emperor Aurelian pulls off a miracle in the 270s, reconquering both breakaway states. Then Diocletian comes along in 284, reforms the entire system, and splits Rome into eastern and western halves with separate rulers, a move that'll have massive consequences later. While Rome's fighting for survival, Persia is having its own shakeup. In 224, the Parthian Empire gets overthrown by the Sassanids under Ardashir I, who start flexing their muscles as Rome's new eastern rival. In Africa, the Aksumite Empire rises in what's now Ethiopia, becoming both a trading powerhouse and a regional military force. Over in China, the collapse of the Han Dynasty in 220 leads to one of the most famous chapters in Chinese history. The Three Kingdoms, Shu, Wu, and Wei, battled it out for decades, with Wei eventually uniting the land under the Jin Dynasty by 280. Elsewhere, Korea's under the rule of its own three kingdoms. Japan enters the Kofun period, and in India, the Gupta Empire starts to rise. In the Americas, the Hopewell culture takes over from the Adena, while the Maya hit their classic era. By the end of the 3rd century, the old order was changing everywhere. The 4th century would bring new religions, shifting borders, and the first real steps toward the medieval world. The 4th century, AD 301 to 400, kicks off with Rome under the rule of Constantine the Great, a man who completely changes the game. He's the first Roman emperor to openly adopt Christianity, and when he becomes sole ruler, he decides the empire needs a new capital. Forget old Rome. In 330, he rebuilds the ancient city of Byzantium into Nova Roma, later renamed Constantinople, which will dominate history for over 1,000 years. The century's last emperor to control both the eastern and western halves is Theodosius I. After he dies in 395, the split becomes permanent. The East grows richer and more important, while Rome itself fades in relevance. By the late 300s, Christianity isn't just tolerated, it's the empire's official religion, and the old pagan traditions that once defined Rome are fading fast. But trouble's brewing. Starting in 376, Germanic tribes begin pushing into Roman territory. These invasions will eventually snowball into the fall of the Western Empire. Over in China, the Jin Dynasty, which had reunited the country back in 280, starts falling apart almost immediately thanks to infighting and invasions from northern tribes. By 317, the Jin court has retreated south of the Yangtze River, marking the start of the Eastern Jin Dynasty. Toward the end of the century, the northern warlord Fu Jian nearly reunites China. But after a crushing defeat at the Battle of Fei River in 383, his empire collapses into civil war. Elsewhere, Korea's three kingdoms, Baekje, Goguryeo, and Silla, are firmly established, setting the stage for centuries of rivalry. By the end of the 4th century, the world's great powers are shifting, and for Rome, the real storm is just ahead. The 5th century will bring invasions, collapses, and the end of the ancient world in the West. The 5th century, AD 401 to 500, is all about chaos, migration, and the collapse of old powers. In Europe, the Western Roman Empire is hanging on by a thread. It's ruled by a string of weak emperors while the real power shifts to military strongmen. In 410, the unthinkable happens. The Visigoths march into Rome and sack the city. Rome recovers a bit, but it's downhill from there. The Vandals, sailing in from Spain, seize Carthage, one of Rome's richest provinces, and turn it into their own base. Just as the empire is trying to take it back, Attila the Hun storms into Europe, threatening both the East and West. After Attila's death, the Romans try one last big push to reclaim North Africa, but the campaign is a disaster. Finally, in 476, the Western Empire officially falls when the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, is deposed. Over in China, the 16 Kingdoms period continues, a messy mix of small states fighting for dominance. In the north, the Northern Wei reunites the region in 439. Meanwhile, in the south, the powerful general Liu Yu forces the last Jin emperor to step down in 420, founding the Liu Song dynasty and kicking off the northern and southern dynasties era. In India, the mighty Gupta Empire, often called the Golden Age of Indian civilization, comes under attack late in the century by the Huna peoples, likely related to the same Huns wreaking havoc in Europe. With Rome gone in the west, new kingdoms rise from its ashes. The 6th century will be an age of shifting borders, new empires, and the first real outlines of the medieval world. The 6th century, AD 501 to 600, marks the final fade-out of the ancient world in the West and the dawn of the Middle Ages. With the Western Roman Empire gone, Europe is a patchwork of small Germanic kingdoms fighting over scraps of territory. Out of this chaos, the Franks emerge as the big winners, building a kingdom that stretches across much of modern France and Germany. Meanwhile, the Eastern Roman Empire, what we now call the Byzantine Empire, isn't just surviving, it's on the offensive. Under Emperor Justinian, they reclaim North Africa from the Vandals and launch massive campaigns to retake Italy, dreaming of restoring the old Roman borders. They don't quite pull it off long-term, but for a moment it looks like the empire might be reborn. Further east, the Sassanid Empire reaches its peak under Khosrau I, becoming a true superpower. In India, the once great Gupta Empire finally collapses under pressure from the Huna invaders. Japan transitions from the Kofun period to the Asuka period, bringing major cultural changes. China, after more than a century and a half of division, is reunited by the Sui dynasty toward the century's end. In Korea, the three kingdoms, Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla, continue their rivalry. And in Central Asia, the Guk Turks rise to power after defeating the Ruran, becoming a new force on the steppe. Across the ocean, Teotihuacan in Mesoamerica begins its decline after centuries of dominance, while the Maya civilization is deep into its classic period, building cities and expanding its influence. By the end of the 6th century, the world is poised for massive change, new religions, new empires, and conflicts that will redraw the map yet again in the 7th century. The 7th century, AD 601 to 700, is dominated by one of the biggest turning points in world history, the rise of Islam. In 622, the Prophet Muhammad unites Arabia under the new faith, and within a decade of his death in 632, Islamic armies are on the move. Under the Rashidun Caliphate, and later the Umayyad Caliphate, they sweep through the Middle East, toppling the powerful Sassanid Empire and taking Syria, Palestine, Egypt, North Africa, and more. By the end of the century, the Islamic world stretches from the edges of India to the Atlantic coast. The Byzantine Empire takes heavy hits from these rapid conquests, losing key territories and also facing waves of Slavic migration into the Balkans. But in the 670s, they manage a massive win by defending Constantinople from an Arab siege, keeping Asia Minor in Byzantine hands and ensuring the empire's survival for centuries to come. Elsewhere in Europe, the Iberian Peninsula sees the Siglo de Concilios, a period defined by the influential councils of Toledo. In the British Isles, Northumbria emerges as the top dog, overshadowing rival kingdoms like Mercia. The Lombards still control most of Italy. Over in Asia, the Sui dynasty in China gives way to the Tang dynasty, which quickly becomes a powerhouse, projecting influence from Korea to Central Asia. In Korea itself, Silla teams up with the Tang to conquer Baekje and Goguryeo, uniting the peninsula under one rule. Japan continues through its Asuka period, building stronger ties with the continent. In India, the ruler Harsha brings unity to the north, pulling together a patchwork of small kingdoms left behind after the Gupta collapse. By the dawn of the 8th century, new empires are rising, old ones are holding on, and the world's power map is shifting fast, setting the stage for even bigger clashes ahead. The 8th century, AD 701 to 800, sees the Islamic world at its height, but also running into its limits. The Umayyad Caliphate dominates North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula, but two major roadblocks stop its westward expansion. The Byzantines hold out at the siege of Constantinople, and in 732, the Franks under Charles Martel win the Battle of Tours, halting the Muslim advance into France. By the mid-700s, the great wave of Arab conquest slows down, marking the end of Islam's initial explosive spread. Meanwhile, Europe's about to get a new headache from the north. Late in the century, Viking longships start appearing on coastlines. These Scandinavian raiders and future settlers will soon shape politics, trade, and warfare across the continent for centuries to come. In Asia, the Tang dynasty in China reaches its golden age under Emperor Xuanzong, controlling trade routes, expanding its borders, and presiding over a booming economy. In Bengal, the Pala Empire rises to power, becoming a major Buddhist center. Over in Japan, the Nara period begins, marked by strong Chinese influence in government, culture, and religion. By the end of the 8th century, old empires have hit their limits. New powers are rising, and the Vikings are just getting started. The 9th century will see invasions, rebellions, and the reshaping of entire regions. The 9th century, AD 801 to 900, is a wild mix of cultural breakthroughs, power struggles, and game-changing invasions. In Europe, the century kicks off with the Carolingian Renaissance, a revival in learning and art under Charlemagne's successors. But it's also prime time for the Vikings. These seafaring raiders aren't just looting and leaving anymore, they're showing up in force. The biggest example? The Great Heathen Army in 865, supposedly led by legends like Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson. They land in East Anglia, take York, and carve out the Kingdom of Jorvik. By the late 800s and 70s, only Wessex is still holding out, and Alfred the Great pulls off a massive win at the Battle of Ethandun in 878, forcing a peace that creates the Danelaw, splitting England between Viking and Anglo-Saxon control. Ireland isn't spared either. The Vikings raid monasteries, seize treasure, and set up permanent bases like Dublin in 841. Scotland feels the heat too, with Viking settlements in Orkney, Shetland, and the northern coast helping to topple the old Pictish kingdoms. Kenneth MacAlpin unites the survivors, becoming the first king of Alba, the early form of Scotland. Meanwhile, the Islamic world is flourishing. In Baghdad, the Abbasids open the House of Wisdom, attracting scholars from everywhere. Here, Al-Khwarizmi develops algebra, and new ideas spread across continents. In West Africa, the Ghana Empire rises as the first great Sahelian kingdom, controlling gold-rich trade routes. In what's now Nigeria, the Igbo Ukwu culture produces stunning bronze sculptures, some of the earliest in sub-Saharan Africa. In Asia, the Tang dynasty starts the century strong under Emperor Xianzong, but ends with the massive Huangchao rebellion. Southeast Asia sees the Mataram kingdom at its height, while Burma establishes the pagan kingdom. Across the ocean, the Maya heartland collapses into civil war, forcing populations north. Art in medieval Europe is almost entirely in the service of the church. Illuminated manuscripts, golden chalices, reliquaries, while architecture begins to revive. Simple moat and bailey castles appear, marking the start of medieval fortifications. By the year 900, Europe is divided between old kingdoms and new invaders. The Islamic world is still leading in science and culture, and Asia's political map is shifting fast. The 10th century will take all of that and push it even further toward the medieval world we know. The 10th century, AD 901 to 1000, closes out the first millennium with major shifts across the world. In China, the chaos following the Tang dynasty's collapse finally settles when the Song dynasty rises, reuniting most of the country after the messy 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period. This marks the beginning of one of China's most remarkable eras in culture, economy, and innovation. The Islamic world is still a powerhouse. In Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain, the Caliphate of Córdoba reaches a cultural and economic peak, with cities like Córdoba and Toledo becoming centers of learning and architecture. Further east, the Samanid Empire under Ismail Samani thrives in Central Asia, while the Abbasid Caliphate still exists, but with its authority weakened and more power in the hands of regional rulers. Europe's also experiencing a cultural comeback. The Byzantine Empire enjoys a revival, winning back some lost territory and reasserting its influence. The First Bulgarian Empire is at its height, and in Central Europe, the Holy Roman Empire enters the Ottonian Renaissance under the rule of Otto I and his successors, blending classical learning with medieval state-building. Not everyone saw this as a golden age. Some later historians called it the Iron Century, or even the Age of Lead and Iron for its wars and instability. But others, like Lynn White, argued it was more like the darkness of the womb, a time of growth and transformation rather than decline. Around 950, the medieval warm period begins, subtly shifting climates and impacting agriculture across the northern hemisphere. As the millennium draws to a close, the stage is set for the high medieval world, a century of crusades, expanding kingdoms, and global connections that will reshape history all over again. And that's the first 10 centuries, from the last days of the ancient world to the doorstep of the medieval high point. In the next video, we'll cover the next 10 centuries, where things get even more dramatic. Hope you'll join me for that.